Hello, welcome to Moto Talk with Steve and Kim. I'm Steve, and that's Kim over there.
Still.
Glad to have you back on the show. We're going to look for some comments there from all you guys. Hey, we're going to continue sort of with last week's theme about buying a motorcycle new to you. It may be used or close to new. Couple little shout outs here. Performance Power Sports. I put Performance Motorcycles here, but that's not it.
No, we know who you're talking about.
Here in Brownsburg, LA Cycle, Whitestown, Propaganda Motorcycles. I just learned about them the other day, and they look like a really legit shop. So if you're out on the east side of Indy, way east,
Richmond East,
check them out. Steel Customs here in Indianapolis. Pickle, we send a lot of Harleys to him, and as well as LA Cycle and BMF Motorcycle Repair here in town, which used to be Dell's. So Bear's really good at what he does there. So if you need any help, shout out to all those people. In Moto news, same thing as last week. We've got April 18th, the 6th annual Vintage Motorcycle Show Swap Meet. That is April 18th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And that host is through CycleWorks. Hey, Gregory McKenzie, how you doing, buddy? Good to see you on there. So CycleWorks LLC up there around the Goshen area. Also, the 38th Midwest Motorcycle Swap Meet. This is mostly Harley and probably Indian. And that's going to be in Danville instead of Indianapolis this year. So they moved it out here to Hendricks County. And did I say when that was? Saturday, April 24th through the 25th there. So the host is Midwest MC, and that is a swap meet. Do you have anything to say about that swap meet?
Just that even though it's primarily Harley Davidson, you're going to find a lot of other stuff there that they don't necessarily care about so much, and you can usually get it at a good price.
Right.
Some of the things you'll find there are maintenance items, and others. Hi, John. Maintenance others and items that might be worth something to you but aren't worth something to them. You have to be careful also out there because there's a fair amount of junk, and don't get lured into buying junk. You can walk right past one and wait till you get a good one.
Yeah, and if you go more than 1 year, you see sometimes you see the same junk over and over. All the swap meets have that, by the way. It's not just those guys.
Nope.
Those guys. Anyway, all right. Well, hey, let's get into this. Last week we talked about what to look for when buying a bike: compression check, oil leaks, spark.
It's like any bike.
Making sure, just like any car you would buy, you want to check all that stuff out. Some people brought up title and make sure the numbers are matching and all that kind of stuff. And some of that's a given. So I was going to kind of move into, we get this a lot at the shop. So someone brings in a motorcycle and they want to do all these mods. They want to mod it out. They want aftermarket pipes. They want aftermarket carbs. They want, a GSXR front end or whatever. And so I thought what we do is talk about some of the bike modifications that people do, or some of the bike builds, so to speak, and explain what those are. I mean, a lot of you out there would be preaching to the choir because you know about all this if you're already in the community, but a lot of people will get into motorcycles because they like a specific look. And so we're talking cafe racer, rat bike, bobber, chopper. So we're going to talk about those and we'll help explain what some of those are. And let's start off with, let me get to my.
So while we're looking for the shot, I want to make sure to say something specific about this. When you are buying a motorcycle that has a particular look, if out of 100 motorcycles that have a similar look, out of that 100, there's probably going to be less than 10 of them that actually work properly.
Yeah.
They might look a certain way, but they're going to have issues because the person that was building it to the look, and it was way form over function.
Yeah.
And they didn't spend a lot of time making the cables the right length. Therefore, you have issues with that. They didn't spend a lot of time making sure that the suspension was correct. They didn't spend any time on that. There were a lot of things that they did, whether to shorten, cut back, throw away, move, whatever they're doing, didn't make the bike either usable or even safe in some cases. So probably higher than 90% of them are less than ideal in regard to using them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with, okay, I'm new to motorcycles. I bought a motorcycle. I want to learn about it, and kudos to everybody that does that. And
Yep.
then they just start doing mods to it,
Yeah,
and they may or may not know how to do it necessarily the right way. And so sometimes you'll take shortcuts. You won't shorten the cable. You'll build a brake bracket that isn't really secured great.
Right, you'll use the wrong materials. You might buy something on eBay that says this is specifically for this bike, and it really isn't. And then when you get it, you find that it doesn't work. We've been bit by that a million times. We got it bit a similar way this last week, where we were doing a pretty high-end restoration. We ordered a part. We believed that that part was going to be like NOS. In fact, it didn't work at all. So we couldn't use it without modifying it again. So there's a lot of effort required to get to the right stuff to make a motorcycle usable.
Yeah, and sometimes to each their own. You know, if you want to take some risk and not have a front brake, because we've had a lot of them come in without a front brake, they just use the rear brake, and it's not necessarily that safe. But if that's the way you want your bike to be and look and all that, more power to you. We're not out here to judge anything, but we have our opinion.
Yeah, my opinion is a motorcycle without a front brake is dangerous.
Yours is usually right.
I don't know.
Mine's more right than yours is.
Yeah, probably. but when you have no front brake, you lose about 75% of your braking power generally, maybe greater than that under some circumstances. Yeah. And if you choose not to ride with one, you're either not riding the thing safely or you don't understand the dynamics going to get you in trouble. And neither one of those things is pleasant when push comes to shove and you have to do something quickly.
A lot of it is how does it look, and does it look cool?
And it was really common back in the 60s and 70s to immediately take the front brake off of a chopper, or put a little tiny front brake on it because they just wanted to minimize the look of it.
Speaking of chopper,
now, in fairness to this particular bike, this is about as OG as you can get of an original, well-built, very carefully assembled chopper from back in the 60s. And that's a 69 XLCH engine. So they were real common with Sportsters. The other thing that's common on this bike is it's using a coffin tank. It's got a hardtail. That frame was purpose built for that bike. It's got a really long springer, probably a 12-inch over springer. And oddly enough, that front brake is from a Gilera. And they used it because it was a drum brake. It was easy to manage.
It's a Gilera hub.
It's a Gilera hub and a Gilera rim and everything. So it was easy to just bolt that on there in between the ends of the fork. And it worked okay, oddly enough. But that bike was put together by some engineers. And they used, at the time, state-of-the-art stuff to assemble it. The paint on it was super high-end back then. And we got it after it spent probably 45 years in a barn. And it was a long road back to making it work at all because things were full of mud and corrosion and nasty stuff. But from the chopper custom point of view, you got to keep in mind, you might want to build this old school chopper and stick with this kind of design, but you have to put up with things like the conditions of a hardtail, the conditions of a Springer front end, how that bike's going to handle. It's certainly not for somebody who isn't familiar with motorcycles.
Right.
Because that bike will challenge you in every way when you're
just
going
in
down
riding
the street.
it. Just pushing it around.
Just starting that one.
Yeah, for sure.
It can hurt you.
Okay, so next up is the bobber look.
Yeah, so this is also really common where people try to minimize what is there, and they put a solo seat on it. In this case, again, somebody at least took the time to weld up a hardtail. They didn't put it in a half-hearted fashion. But you can see that they've got some peculiarities there, like the rear brake is mounted to what was probably the original brake mounting on the frame, but they cut off the back part of the frame. So that part is just cantilevered in there. And that's undoubtedly not ideal. And it's got controls that are more or less in the same place they were when the bike was new. It's got some straight pipes. There's nothing wrong with straight pipes except that they don't work very well.
And your typical pod filters.
And that's what looks like a CB650 maybe, Honda. And those were pretty gutless to begin with. So when you start using that as the core of your motorcycle, you're going to have issues with pod filters and shortcut straight pipes and that sort of thing. One thing that helps you with a motorcycle like this is it's a wet sump motorcycle, so you don't really have to have a separate oil tank.
You're not worried about building an oil tank and putting it somewhere.
Yeah. The other thing they did with this bike was they shortened the front end. and you can see how short that is. There's almost no ground clearance. We've got a customer who's a good friend of the group that I've known for many years, and I asked him one day, why would you compromise your safety by putting it so close to the ground that the pegs scrape every time you turn?
Every time you turn.
And he said, well, motorcycles are dangerous, and I'm living on the rough side of dangerous. And I'm like, yeah, okay, fine.
Yep, that's right.
Again, that's definitely form over function.
And so, along with this, what I wanted to try to talk about as we go through this is the cost of something like this. When someone brings you a mostly stock bike and they're like, I want that look, but I want it done for like $2,000.
Yeah, that's almost mission impossible.
Now you might be able to find that particular bike right there for $4,000, but you still couldn't build that for $4,000 if you can't do most of the work yourself.
That's right. And to your point, if you can buy that bike for $4,000 and that's the look you want, and you can look it over and make sure everything works properly, that's probably a better plan for you than trying to build it yourself.
Yeah, most of the time you can have 50 hours, 100 hours in something like that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
If you can't do most of the work yourself, you're gonna fork out a lot of dough.
And you got to remember, when you're changing it so drastically from what it was to begin with to what this thing looks like, there's every aspect of that bike that has to be thought of: where the brake lines run, where the chain goes, how you adjust things, what kinds of accommodations have you made for pivots and controls, and mounting electrics, mounting batteries, mounting virtually everything in a bike. And if it's not carefully done, and we see this every single day, where batteries are poorly mounted and the ground winds up getting up against something.
Yeah, or the positive gets up against the
we had somebody
frame.
build us what you would otherwise consider a really beautiful bike.
Right.
But if you remember the one I'm thinking of, it had a metal cover over the battery that immediately grounded the positive cable every time you put the cover on it. And it was, they just didn't think about the ramifications of building this box that way.
And a lot of times when people try to build their electrical box and they throw everything in there, including the regulator rectifier that has cooling fins, it doesn't get any air movement and breathe. And then you end up with a melted harness.
So you got to think about all of that.
So the high end builders, like this guy, he's from Brownsburg, Gary Gamble, and he's done some custom jobs. Now, this is kind of a custom rat bobber. You could add all kinds of titles to this. And he's attached all kinds of, weird stuff to make it look cool or whatever. And he usually thinks that stuff through pretty well, and he's changing tire sizes and widths and rim sizes. Not necessarily on this rim size wise, but the big fat tires, you gotta accommodate for the cooling radiator right behind the tire and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a million things about this that I would have a hard time with, but but in fairness to Gary, when he's building these, he's building them primarily for the look.
Yes, he's an artist.
He'll say that it can go down the street. Maybe you can use it some, but it probably wouldn't be your go-to bike for a long trip or even riding it regularly. But it is cool to look at, and it's got a lot of detail. But there's several things he's done here. One of the things he's done is he's removed virtually all of the front end travel. You can see that there's almost nothing left in the front end travel. And if it was there, it might have that giant tire come up and hit that radiator.
Not just a hardtail.
Yeah, it's not.
It's a hard front.
Yeah, and in this case, I'm not sure. You can't really see how he achieved the way that rear end is put together. But I don't think there's any suspension back there at all. And you can get your pants leg caught in those timing gears.
I don't remember what he did on that. He may have done like a single.
But again, he's more about the look of it, the patina, the mix of parts, the general obvious change from a stock bike. And Gary, Steve says artist. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But he's not married to function.
Yeah. Here's another one that he's done. He actually took this is an 2015. I believe
it's an Evo Sportster.
That's not an Indian, right?
No, that's an Evo Sportster.
And he made it look, 40, 50 years old.
Yeah. And he put a bunch of unlike parts on that bike that weren't common to the motorcycle. And he has a really good method that he tries to keep under his belt about how he makes them look rusty and beat. He, puts material on the outside of things and leaves them out in the yard for a week.
Yep. He won't tell me any of his secrets.
But there's a million things on that bike. Again, even though you can't.
Sorry for the fuzzy picture too.
That's okay. You can't really focus in on it. But again, he's removed most of the front end travel. It's got a little tiny seat that's going to be uncomfortable to begin with, but if you hit something, and this bike has forward controls, if you think about it, when you're building a bike like that, you're when you're riding a conventional motorcycle, a lot of your weight is on the balls of your feet because your pegs are right underneath you. But if on this motorcycle,
you're riding on your butt,
you're sitting right on your ass, and all of the bouncing transfer of shock from the road hits you right up the spine, and your feet are in the front. So when you reduce the amount of suspension you have available, God help you if it's a hardtail, it puts you in a position where that bike is going to get disrupted a lot by any inconsistency in the road.
right?
And you have to think way ahead of stuff like that, or you wind up hurting yourself. And it's just something you have to think about when you're putting it together, what you're looking
And
at.
again, the time that is spent on something like this, you wouldn't necessarily want to spend. It's that bike you're going to be able to buy for way less than
Yeah.
the time and the money that was put into
Yeah,
it.
I think sometimes Gary does those on concession. Like somebody will say, build me this. Like, I think that might have been one of them.
Yeah.
And that's fine if the guy wants to hand him $15,000 and say, do that.
Right.
Because he just wants to look at it.
That's true.
You know, you never know.
They might just set it in the garage and look at it.
Yeah, but if you, and I'm going to say this as a kind of a commercial, and I didn't see Dusty Pine out there, but if he was on here live, he'd agree with me. You can buy Evo Sportsters all day for not much money. Nick Avert's on here.
Hey,
He'll
Nick.
agree with that. Speaking of LA Cycle,
Bill and Roger.
you know, you can buy Evo Sportsters all day for somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000. And if you want to try to do an inexpensive look, whether it's cafe bike, chopper, bobber, those are great platforms to begin with, because you don't have to spend a lot of money on it, and the parts are abundant to make them change.
Right. Here's here's one that you would consider, I guess you would call it a street fighter. Sometimes I categorize that in with like the Mad Max look, but what's typically the street fighter look? It's
so
you
usually
kinda
with
take
a street
sport bike,
fighter, somebody's taking a sport bike, removing all
remove
the
the stuff,
you know, all the plastic off of it, putting a singular headlight, making sure that everything's as minimal as it can be. Like in this case, that cantilevered subframe, the single-sided swing arm on this bike is all interesting, but it also means that they probably are more interested in looking at this than using it, because it's got those big knobby tires, which are going to be pretty limited to what you can do with them. You can't really go very fast down the road. They're not very good for street traction. That bike is going to be terrible for off-road. So it's a big compromise to have it look gnarly as all get out, but still have it not necessarily be very functional.
Yeah,
but it's
most of the time it's about the look. Yeah, but,
it's
you
a
know,
look people really like.
Just like these Harley baggers have been very popular over the last 4 or 5 years with the big, 23-inch wheels or bigger.
And
and
we've had one
bags.
of those come in the shop where the guy, in this case, it was a Kawasaki. It was a big, not bobber, but a big bagger Kawasaki that looked very similar to this. And he wanted to put a 23-inch front wheel on it. And he thought it was just a bolt up because he bought it on eBay, sent it to us, and here we go. But the issue he didn't think about was the fender gets into the frame because it's so big. The fender doesn't have the same arc as that tire, so you can't really put the stock fender back on. The stock fender on his bike was also the fork brace, and it lost its integrity when you removed it. So there were a lot of engineering concepts that really got cast aside when he was trying to put that big wheel on the front of that bike. Now, while it was in there, I found a way to kind of massage it in there, and I got it to fit, but the suspension travel was impacted because that tire is so big. As soon as the suspension begins to come down, it gets messed up. These bikes, this particular one in the photo, is interesting because it represents where people are putting stereos, and they're putting a lot of other accessories in those bags. It might even have air in the back to get the whole thing to lay down on the ground. It's just a completely different culture of riding that people want.
Yeah, John Hill's got a pretty good question here. He says, how about a well done and capable RD350? Now, a lot of people will take an RD350 and make a cafe racer out of it. That's what we're going to talk about next. Just minimalizing everything and just having this cafe out two-stroke, that sounds amazing and is quick.
Yeah, so RDs are pretty good to begin with. So if you leave the suspension more or less at the height that you want it and it's pretty stock, you can put rear sets on them. You can put low bars on them. You can put chambers on there. You can tune to the chambers. It's not ideal, but you can certainly tune to the chambers. And if you leave the porting alone on that RD350, it's probably a good runner. I don't see Keith Carlson out there, but he and his brothers have built any handful of different RD
Right.
variants, whether it's 350s, 400s, whatever. And they'll agree as soon as you, like an RD350, to John's point, is a what am I trying to say? It's a reed valve engine. And a reed valve engine is way more forgiving of carburation pipes, all that. One of the most popular things to put on an RD350 is a better ignition, because it saves a lot of tuning problems. People can't figure out why they're always fouling plugs, but if they put a good, strong ignition in it, they can be pretty far off in the tune and the thing will still run. So the one downside for John Hill I'll give you is that RD350s themselves, because they only made them for a couple of years, the parts for those are becoming really dear, and the bikes are being more sought after as collectibles. It doesn't have to be a stock RD350 to cost a lot of money, no matter what somebody does with it.
But they're fun, they're light, they're quick, you
Yeah.
can maneuver. And I know that's why our buddy Keith liked them so much,
Yeah.
to take them down to Deals Gap, and from stoplight to stoplight, they're very quick.
Yeah, there's very few bikes that are better all around motorcycles than a dead stock RD350.
And of course, we would argue the point of taking a really nice stock Survivor and cutting it all up. But
yeah, that'd be a big mistake.
again, we're not here to judge. If you own it, it's your bike. You do what you want with it, but it's nice to keep the original Survivors nice and original. And then if you want to cut one up, take a junk one and tear it down and make it your own.
Yeah, there was a TV show where a guy was going to do a build for a former racer, and he used an original 69 CB750 that the guy had. And the gentleman wanted him to build it as a street fighter kind of bike.
Mm-hmm.
So they very publicly showed him taking the just CB750 original 69 instruments, throwing them all the way across the garage into a trash bin.
Yeah.
He was taking off, irreplaceable parts and throwing them away. And it's just the way people do things.
Yeah. Hey, Steven, if you have a picture of Keith's, the one you bought off Keith, the 400, see if you're able to post that in the comments. I'm interested to know that.
Yeah, that's an example of a really excellent one.
Thanks for showing up. Bill, how you doing? You stopped chopping CB750s. Yep. So some of them are just so far gone, you can just tear them down and then build whatever you want. But if you find one that's a nice, in original condition, and maybe you only need to, get a couple fenders and a nice seat and some paint and make it back to stock, they're actually worth a little more when they're stock and original.
I think that's pretty much the consensus now, because there's a big wave of stop ones. The thing though is CB750s were also very popular chopper stuff back in the day, and
almost any of those categories people have done a CB750 with those as well. Yeah. So here's another example of a cafe racer.
Yeah, so to me this is the definitive cafe bike, because A, it's English, B, that's a Norton frame, C, that's a non-unit Triumph engine. It's using a lot of parts, including a 4-leading shoe front brake. It's got alloy rims. It's got a nice seat. It's got Lucas Electrics. It's got small bars. And just the way that bike is built screams out the original cafe racer. And I think as you get further away from when bikes like that were built to go to the Ace Cafe or ride through London, the problem is they get further away from the definition of what a cafe racer really is. Because back in the day, it used to be you'd go out to your friend's bar or cafe, and you'd have some challenge from your co-riders to get from point A to point B and see who got there the fastest. That's why they called them cafe racers. And when they weren't competing on a track, they were trying to modify their bikes and modify their bikes and modify their bikes, so they were the fastest between one cafe and the other. But then some things changed as well in that thing, and it became rockers against mods, which mods were usually people that rode scooters, and rockers were people that rode stuff like that cafe bike. Again, that's kind of the high end of it, because the frame on the bike that you had in the picture there is actually a Norton frame called a feather bed, and you can see that it goes all the way around the engine. There's a cradle essentially. It holds it all together.
Mhm.
It's a very stiff. Those are Norton Dominator forks as well. So that's going to be a really good handling bike. But that motorcycle there represents kind of the pinnacle
It's
of it.
pretty close, yeah.
That's a 25,000 minimum bike right there.
I would say
today.
that the one thing that it would be missing would maybe be the lower bars, because they wanted to get down and get that aerodynamics going.
Yeah, when
bending
you
all
get
the way down.
clip-ons on, it makes it almost
At our
impossible
age,
to
we
ride
don't
on the
want to do
street.
that
Not even.
anymore, or at
Yeah.
least not for very long.
Thank you, no.
So yeah, so that all boils down to basically, Stephen was trying to post a picture on there. Yeah, so we'll probably get that on there and show that down the road. We might have Keith on here and talk about some of his builds. But the main point is, and we could talk about this forever. When you buy a motorcycle and you want to mod it out, and let's just pretend that you don't know how to do any of the work, and you're going to take it to a shop, doesn't matter who, and you're going to have some stuff done. A lot of times it's more cost effective to find a bike that's already been done, but at the same time, you need to find one that's been done by someone that kind of knows what they're doing, like you were talking about early on.
Yeah,
where everything is usable.
The thing that you have to think about is that just because you bought a bunch of parts that might look like what you think they should look like, if it hasn't been integrated into the design of the bike so that it's usable and safe,
Right.
you're going to have to spend some time, money, or energy making it work.
Right. And I will give for instance, someone brought a CB 500 to the shop. So it would be a mid to early 70s CB 500 inline 4. And someone had done a not great job of making it a cafe racer look.
How many times has that happened? Like 50?
A lot.
Yeah.
But the example is that he paid close to $1,000 for this bike, and it was a totally non-running bike, and
but it looked the part.
It did look the part
from 20 feet,
but it didn't run. It had wiring issues. The front brake didn't work at all, and so he was going to spend another $1,200, $1,500, maybe even $2,000 getting it just running, riding, and barely stopping before he could even go into the cosmetics, paint and all that kind of stuff, paint, wheels, spokes. And so you can go out there and look for something for $2,000 or $3,000, $4,000 that's already been done, and then you're pretty much automatically riding the bike on the spot.
Yeah.
So,
agreed.
All right. Well, hey, we're going to wrap it up here. We've got a couple more minutes. Kim, why don't you go into the essentials? Kim's Essentials.
Okay.
Kim's Moto Essentials. We don't have a name for it.
I'm still staying generic. Like any motorcycle, if you do anything with it yourself, and this is not limited to motorcycles, but it's something you should have in your toolbox no matter what. I'm sure everybody's got something that looks like this. If you don't, go to Harbor Freight. They're like $5. It's an extendable magnet. And this is a really heavy duty one. You can lift 4 or 5 pounds with this one without any difficulty. But sometimes it helps you when you're trying to do something that's fiddly and it's up against something. You can physically put this in there before you even start. It's not just for retrieval. It's for if something falls, it'll stick to it on the way down and maybe keep it from going in somewhere else.
That's
so
true.
you can't have too many of these, but you should have at least one. And I would recommend getting one that's halfway nice like this, not one of those pocket ones that comes apart and breaks like a pen.
And if Brad Martin can't find one, we can send him one down in Mexico.
Yes,
He's listening to us.
I'll stick to your ear. Yeah. And then the other thing, this is kind of a me thing, but I think everyone.
I don't even have one of those.
Right. I think everybody who works on bikes and needs to see things up close needs one of these. So they come in a little case like this. This one is German, I think, but it's called an optical comparator. And originally they were made specifically to be used in map reading. It's in a little bit of an unusual spot, but they can be focused by moving this arm so that when you put this down on a piece of paper like this, you can see what you're looking at on the piece of paper. And that would be things like jets and bolts and things that get scored and damaged. And you can actually see it very, very closely, something you can't see with the naked eye. And if you get a really good one of these, they're calibrated in thousandths across the front of it. So you can actually compare things that you need to be able to see up close that you can't really see with your glasses. And in my case, I found online, and they're really inexpensive, and everybody should think about this, bifocal safety glasses. And
Okay,
I think
I've got some. I finally got mine in the mail.
Yeah, so
they work pretty good.
They're just cheap plastic safety glasses, but they're bifocals, and I think they cost like $10 or $12 for the cheap ones, and they work really, really well, because even if you don't need the correction when you're working day by day, if you need to get something in front of your face up close that you can see, they're really, really good for that. And most of even the inexpensive ones come with a
another motorcycle.
I got nothing for that.
Essential.
Okay.
The magnet for the floor. Hey, I need to use this. I've used it twice already.
Yeah. So, one benefit is if you have a floor like this one, you can see stuff on it. But the other thing is, if you use that magnet for the floor, or even this one in a typical workshop environment, you're going to come up with all kinds of fuzz.
There's a smaller one of those they make on a little tiny telescopic thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Don't bother with one of those, because they don't hold anything and they don't do anything. You got to start with
But I have gotten spark plugs out with that.
Oh, well, yeah, you can do that.
So, yeah, we can do that.
All right.
All right, guys. Well, hey, we're a minute over, but it doesn't really matter, because we can do whatever we want. Safety tip of the day: when at a stoplight and the light turns green, don't just go. Look left, right, left, because they don't always stop when there's a red light. Okay? You guys all take care. We'll see you later.
So long, everybody.